All right, I think we jump on in, and then if folks miss our excellent intros, we can send them the follow-up. Does that sound good to you?
Sounds great.
All right, let's do it. So a couple of housekeeping things before we jump fully into the content for everyone who's on the line. Our audience is muted today. We're running this in a full webinar format, but we do want to hear your questions and thoughts because these are topics where everyone who works in mobile product and mobile marketing is really looking at these things from a day-to-day basis. So if you have questions, go ahead and ask them in the Q&A bar. Dan's going to be keeping a look at that as we go through. Some things we might take a little bit of a sidebar and jump right into as we talk through these topics, and other things we might save for our Q&A section at the end. So there will be time for that after we wrap. And we'll make sure to get into all of the questions and the thoughts that you guys have on this topic. And then lastly, this webinar is being recorded. We'll send it out to everybody afterwards in addition to the slides. So if there are things that you want to double click on or you missed a part of it when we got started, we'll send that out.
So about us, my name is Dan Amati. I'm one of the presenters in this webinar. I'm currently heading up demand generation and international marketing for Branch. A little bit about me, I love data. I would call myself a data nerd. I also love avocados, really in all formats. I can eat them by themselves, which some people think is weird. And then, during COVID, we always like to talk about this. I feel like it changed a lot of people. For me, I started a backyard garden. Haven't yet started to grow avocados, but definitely other vegetables and plants, especially tomatoes. I've been loving that. In terms of experience that I bring, I've been in marketing and marketing operations for over 10 years. I feel like I live and breathe data. So I'm really excited to be here and share some tips with all of you today.
And then I'm Amanda Grady. Most people here call me Grady. So if Dan calls me that, you'll know why. Fun facts about me, I am a former D1 rower and somewhat needlessly competitive. So metrics are always of interest to me in the ways that I can think about proving things out. I don't like fruit. It's my strangest quirk, but for the record, I am cool with avocados. They kind of sit in that weird space where people who get into it will point it out, definitely with Dan on that one. And then I'm really obsessive about context and cross-functional alignment. So I love metrics for that purpose. I think they are the language by which business is executed. And especially in mobile, where things constantly change, I think it's an incredibly useful context for evaluating it and putting these things to the test. Where I come from working on strategy at Branch is I've met with hundreds of customers in different verticals and geos over the past almost 5 years to talk about how they approach these things through the Branch context, but also more broadly as we look at the market and think of it as a product team about where we want to evolve. And a lot of my work is centered on guiding growth strategies for customers across paid, using their owned and earned channels more carefully. And so that's the context I'll bring to our webinar today.
Exciting. So diving right into what we'll talk about today, we have a lot to go over. So we've split this webinar into 5 parts. And we've listed that on the next slide. Okay, so first we'll cover what you should have in place to have a solid foundation for your measurement. Then we'll dive into basic attribution metrics. We're calling these the core 4 because they're 4 metrics you absolutely should get right. And then we'll head into 3 more sets of metrics focused around retention, efficiency, and then some more advanced metrics saved for the end for those of you with a larger appetite for data. So diving right into foundations, how do you make sure that you have everything set up correctly? So some of the things that we would recommend, definitions would be the top one. Make sure that you have, when a stat is referred to, everybody is aligned and agrees upon what that definition of that stat is in advance. One thing we recommend is to write your own data dictionary that points to how those metrics are defined, how they're calculated, as well as the source of truth for those metrics. You can see this word cloud on the right. There's a lot of things you could be measuring. So balance is key. You can't improve all the metrics here at once. So what do you want to focus on at first as an organization to make sure that you're making incremental progress? So definitely just because you can't measure something doesn't mean that you should, especially starting out. And what we'll talk about in the rest of the webinar is helping you understand what are the most important metrics for your current challenges. And then as you grow and mature, you can keep adding in more and more metrics to optimize as you grow.
I think we think that concept of data ontology and where sources of truth are and how that looks for downstream consumers of that data is incredibly important. One thing, especially when it comes to mobile in particular, that we encourage teams to get aligned on at the very start when they are especially engaging in paid is the kind of methodology that's going to be used for attribution. Now, some of this is dependent on your mobile measurement provider, but one thing that will be the same regardless of who you use on that front will really be, are we going to do just click-based attribution where we have that strong piece of user intent, a user actually clicks on something we've put out and then we measure that, or are we also going to engage in view-through attribution? Getting that aligned at the start and the types of campaigns where both are used can really help put your teams on the same basis as they address everything from impact to changes to make to overall incrementality. So as we start out, one thing that we encourage people to have conversations around, as especially teams that are more nascent to the paid space may not have this concept, which is a little bit less relevant in terms of more lifecycle marketing or owned and earned channels.
So let's dive into the metrics, Grady. Let's start with the core four. So the first one we'll cover is attributed installs. This is defined by the number of first app sessions tied back to a particular campaign. It's a really helpful measure to determine how a campaign is resonating with your market, your audience, and specifically how it's driving installs for your app. But it does not address anything further down the funnel, anything that happens after the install. The next one we'll cover is attributed opens. So this one is similar to attributed installs in that it's tied to a specific campaign, but it's different in that it counts the number of opens instead of installs. Specifically, we're counting both new users and returning app users. So this might be your go-to stat if you're focused on getting users into your app more than getting new users signed up for your app. So here's a great example of Pete's Coffee. I was actually looking at their ads over the weekend, and they're running this campaign about pumpkin spice lattes on Facebook. When I engage with that ad, it takes me directly to the Pete's app, and now I have opened their app, and this would, by this definition, be an attributed open. So moving on, attributed conversions. If you have conversion events that you'd like to track within your app, this could be a good metric for you, and it measures, it's defined by the number of conversions tied back to a specific campaign. So something to note here is conversions don't always need to be purchases. Maybe you're tracking when somebody invites a friend to the app or completes their profile or finishes the onboarding setup. These can all be set up as conversions and tied back to a campaign. So here's we're gonna choose Pete's again. Here's another example. Pete's has these great banners printed on their storefronts with a QR code. And if you scan the QR code, it will take you directly to the app. And perhaps when you're in that app, you add something to your order ahead. That adding to the cart action or adding or completing a purchase could be designed as an attributed conversion and tracked that way. And finally, we get to the last one of the core four, which is attributed revenue. This is the amount of revenue associated with a particular campaign and is really helpful for tying bottom of the funnel activity to top of the funnel spend. So a common example of this is if an app offers in-app purchases or subscriptions and you can tie a monetary amount to that activity, then attributed revenue is a great stat to use to tie these things together.
And one of the things to call out, anyone who's working in this space typically knows this. We often talk about in terms of campaigns. Most teams who are looking at it are looking at a lot of the associated metadata with the campaign, right? They're looking at how their specific creatives are performing, how specific sub-publishers within an ad network are performing, how geos are breaking out. So when we think about talking about how a campaign is performing, really think about continuing to break it down to those constituent parts and look at these metrics as a part of that. That in and of itself adds a lot of complexity to your overall campaign evaluation, and is why more and more we've seen, especially paid media teams, really have a focus on being able to pull their own SQL queries, dive deep into this data, because it really is relevant in terms of spending their budget well. So even just these core four can actually add a lot of complexity to your paid media team's work just by having a few simple metrics here. So anything we add on top of that will go ahead and increase that complexity as we move ahead. When we think about reporting the numbers up and out, this is one of the first places where our metrics can get a little bit complex. And one of the things that we think about from this perspective is really what is the norm in the mobile marketing world versus the CMO world, because these are really the two worlds we inherently live in. And it creates a little bit of a tough conversation because this gets at the conflict of kind of individual and team level incentives versus an overall business goal. And as we think about reporting metrics up and making sure that our teams continue to get budget, we prove the value of the investment in mobile, and we continue to raise its profile internally, especially at non-mobile first companies that are going through that mobile transformation. Doing this well is really key towards building that overall profile of the business. So in the mobile marketing world, we see a few things, right? It's historically been focused on the impact of paid campaigns, somewhat in isolation from other channels. So when MMP started out, it was really look at all of your paid media touch points and understand what's actually driving whatever metric you're looking at as a part of that core four, classically install or a specific action. And really, that's where I think about the MMP world sitting between that 2015 to 2017 era, is that deduplication of paid campaigns. The other things that are a part of this is that it's often reported separately from lifecycle campaign aspect or other non-paid acquisition channels. And that makes a lot of sense when you look at where it came from. As mobile apps have become a standard part of Fortune 500 strategy in the last 3 years in particular, and frankly, the COVID period in a very intense way, there's been more of a focus on mobile as a broader part of the customer journey and business revenue generation, as opposed to just being an island in and of itself. And because of that, we're seeing additional pressure for mobile teams to report out in a way that looks at the world in the CMO way as well. And what we mean by that is this need to deduplicate multiple team or channel claims on revenue to reconcile that revenue number that's reported up with what actually is seen in practice. So we could have a mobile ads team reporting that they're driving 20 million in revenue. The email team or push team, typically our lifecycle team, is reporting 10 million. The actual total is 25. There's a delta there. And so whoever owns that revenue number, we see putting increasing pressure, as this is a huge part of the monetization on understanding what really is incremental and where they need to be placing their bets. If your MMP isn't architected to do that, it can get a little bit challenging, especially as we add in the focus on incrementality, as budgets really are allocated the best way possible. Typically, what we see the issue coming in on is that teams will be, or how teams do this today is they'll be looking at what does their overall install look like that's been attributed to a paid campaign versus organic. Are they cannibalizing organic just at a broad level, or are those installs looking incremental? Typically that's done on a daily basis. Sometimes it's running on-off tests can help us get that incrementality perspective. Doing analysis with tools like an Adobe, where an MCID can help merge user personas across multiple properties, or in working directly with a data analysis or BI team. One of the challenges that we'll hear voiced by paid media teams, this kind of old school paid media MMP focus only world, is that there's a concern about if we deduplicate against these other channels, especially from a CPA perspective, potentially my team looks like it's getting less credit or doing less of the work. And that's a concern that I think it's very much understood because the world has changed a lot here. I think it can be remediated by careful goal setting at different levels of the business. ICs who might really want to live in that world versus managers versus teams that are reporting into the CMO. The fact of the matter is, if you're running a serious business, someone is doing this analysis. BI, data analytics, the team itself, someone is running this and stepping in as a thought leader and making sure that you really are spending your paid media spend, especially if it's acquisition focused for your app, on dollars that are incremental and not just cannibalizing a user who would have downloaded the app and then converted anyway, can be a really powerful part of continuing again to raise that profile, as well as the team's overall incorporation into the marketing apparatus. All right. One of the first retention metrics we're going to look at is day end retention. This is about as classic as it gets. So the percentage of app users acquired on day 0 who are still active on the target day. This can differ a little bit by company and by vertical, but the most common ones we see are day 1, that day after install, day 3, day 7, and day 21, and then following up on monthly retention cohorts after that. I want to call out here that having a conversation amongst your team about the retention type you're looking at can really matter. Sometimes this is more discussed in the realm of product analytics, but it's incredibly important for the entire mobile growth team across marketing and product to have a shared vocabulary around it for a couple of reasons. Let's talk about standardizing on what these are and then get into the reasons. So day end retention is really related to what users came back on a specific day. So if we look at day 3 retention from this end day retention, we can see it's the users that came back on exactly day 3. For some industries, especially gaming, there are specific end day retention indicators that are used to think about performance and valuation. Day 7 comes up a lot. For other industries, this concept of unbounded retention can actually be either a more useful way or as useful of a way to look at things. So unbounded retention is this idea of which users came back on that designated day or after. And so if we're looking at day 3 retention from an unbounded retention perspective, a user came back on day 3 or this day 6 would still go into that day 3 retention. Technically, so for a lot of industries, again, that unbounded retention makes more sense because you're really looking at the inverse of churn, right? Who are my users who are still around at this point or later? One thing I'll call out here is that traditionally in the mobile stack vendor space, not just MMPs, but CDPs, marketing automation, there's been a lot of reliance on uninstalls instead of unbounded retention to get a sense of who's still around. My view on this personally, and it's shared by Branch at a product level, is that the mechanism by which uninstalls are tracked is fairly unpalatable through the lens of user privacy, which we're seeing come up more and more from a brand equity perspective, a compliance with Apple policy perspective, because silent push notifications are used to get that. With such scattershot access to IDFAs after iOS 14, plus the iOS 15 update that background pushes will only be delivered if the app has been in the foreground for the past few weeks, the cost benefit analysis of using uninstall tracking at kind of a device level as an input around who's still around versus using unbounded retention, I just don't think it's there anymore to specifically use uninstall for the risks it puts on your company as well as the actual benefit of the data it gives you. There's been a lot of, it's very vogue in the media to talk about that. So something to have a conversation on with your team if you're trying to get a sense of, for my campaigns, what is the value by who's actually sticking around. I can still see the benefit of, for example, mobile marketing automation or someone who actually delivers push notifications, maybe a Braze, using this data. But again, the concerns that come up, especially in that context of paid media evaluation and the opt-ins that are necessary, I would have a conversation with your team if you're still using that instead of unbounded retention. And in terms of what does good look like, because this is a topic that a lot of articles are published on, there are 2 key things that matter here. We can talk about stats all day and I'll give them in a second, but the 2 things I'll call out are number 1, vertical matters, and number 2, timing matters. So some verticals inherently perform better than others. For verticals with lower overall retention rates, oftentimes the monetization equation gets there by either longer conversion windows. Think a rover. Maybe you're not downloading the app to have your dog boarded that night, but you're going to do it in 2 months when you go on summer vacation, or a Redfin. You're not buying a house today, but you are in 6 months. And so you want to get a sense of what the market looks like, or incredibly high LTV when a user does convert, even if it's on a slightly shorter basis. The verticals that perform disproportionately well in terms of driving up that retention metric tend to be along the lines of things you might expect, things that either build habits or have a really specific high intent user download. Those are things like health, social, dating, things that tie into specific periods that we'll talk about in a second. Typically, the other part of that is timing, where certain verticals will perform disproportionately well in certain periods. So for example, health apps, first 60 days of the year tend to see higher retention than almost any other cohort. The other place will be, especially things involved with sports, tend to do really well during that season, significantly higher retention rates. That helps balance out some of the overall seasonality in the investment profile. When we're looking at overall stats, these are probably ones that you've heard before because they've been fairly stable. Day 1, where day 0 is the download, can be between 20 to almost 40%. Typically, we see around 35. Gaming can throw that off a little bit. On day 21, that 9 to 10% is fairly standard. We've seen outsized gains on that retention period at the 3-week mark from apps like music, weather, crypto, things that really become a part of the user's day-to-day and quickly form that habit. And then the drop-off that we see between day 21 and day 30 is fairly minimal. So from an average of 10% on day 21 to 9% on day 30. So if you can architect your campaigns and then your follow-up onboarding and lifecycle touches to really make that user experience make sense by day 21, those users tend to be the ones who stick with you longer term. Lastly, I'll say that across the board, organic outperforms paid when it comes to retention. When we say organic, we're talking about the users that download without a paid touch, but oftentimes an owned or earned touch from another one of your properties. The challenge with that, obviously, is that it's less controllable. Those paid focus campaigns give us as marketers the ability to really turn on the faucet, which can be incredibly important if we're looking to balance out over a reporting period, top of funnel installs or monetization, depending on the bid strategy. And the ability to do that can be really critical if you're looking at a fundraise or quarterly public reporting that's going to be scrutinized by the market. That can be a little bit harder to do with organic. So if you are pursuing a blended CPA model or blended overall budget that incorporates organics, think about using web campaigns to fill up that top of funnel. They can oftentimes be significantly cheaper from a CPM perspective. And if you're bringing new users, introducing them to your brand through a web touch, and then later acquiring them as organic users from another channel and just introducing them to your app, you can see higher retention rates overall. But it's more complicated to manage that funnel. So you want to make sure your team is well aligned and thinking smartly. All right.
So moving on to additional retention metrics. So this one is active users. We see this represented as either DAU or MAU. So the way that this gets defined is the number of app users that are observed within a defined period. So DAU is obviously daily, MAU is active within the past month. So this is a really helpful overall metric to show how many people are actively users of your app.
If we're looking at DAU and MAU as a form of that retention, there's a lot of obvious ways to try and drive that up, especially MAU, which tends to be a good view of user stability and growth over time. Most of these are channels that we see companies who have a good mobile strategy engage in: email, push, retargeting ads, investing in SEO and organic touch points that can bring your user back to the app, remind them of why it deserves space on their phone. The challenge in being able to do this really well is giving your users a compelling reason to let you touch them on this channel. Where that doesn't make sense and a user feels like they're going to be overloaded, you'll see fewer opt-in rates to these channels. And then you end up really reliant on things like retargeting, which can add more to your budget, frankly, than if you got that access to push or email. And SEO, always a challenge, but some teams do that really well as well. One thing to call out here in terms of this overall idea of kind of win back or aligning on how do we move up MAU by bringing users back to the app consistently is who owns the cost of that, whose budget does it go into, and how is it calculated along with some of the later metrics we'll discuss. There's two ways to consider that. One is increase in overall CPA as we engage in some of these types of campaigns. So if you're looking at paid retargeting campaigns, just consider that in your overall profile of being able to drive up MAU. So you can have an initial cost to acquire. $3 was in 2020 what we saw in North America for iOS users as the sort of aggregate cost or average cost. A retargeting ad can add an additional budget on top of that, which can move an overall CPA up significantly. Some teams will split this out where the retargeting team owns a certain budget, and on a last touch, they measure against that. Other teams will have this blended and just tie it all together for an overall CPA for a specific type of user. So it's important to talk about how that factors into your team performance and where you're spending budget. The other way of looking at this, and we saw this on the last slide where we talked about some of those hooks to pull people back into the app, is this concept of how discounting can impact revenue and how that can tie into overall CPAs, as well as like what the return on ad spend is as you think about bringing users back and making them loyal. Some companies will see great monetization where it makes a ton of sense to engage in these kind of discounts to bring users back and keep them active users because, again, the profile of cost versus discounting is really there. I'll call out two I've gotten in the past couple of days around food delivery. Apparently, it's a very profitable business. Who would have known? But we also see this with things like travel and lots of other types of companies. So just make sure that as you engage in some of these strategies to bring users back, keep them active, keep that cohort alive month over month, that you talk about who ends up owning that metric and how decisions are made around how these cohorts are solicited with these various strategies. Just something as you think about the whole perspective to align on as a team and use your metrics smartly.
Awesome. So we're talking a lot about cost of acquisition, cost of engagement, lots of costs. And as a marketer, I know resources are always limited. So at some point, the question of efficiency pops up. So let's talk about metrics that can shed light on that a bit. First one we want to dive into is cost per install. Also, the acronym for this is CPI. You'll start to see us merging some of the metrics that we discussed earlier with the core four into these metrics. So this one is the total amount of money invested in a campaign divided by the number of attributed installs, again, associated back to that campaign. This stat is super helpful for comparing top of the funnel activities and optimizing your investment. One great thing that happens when you define this metric is that you get baseline costs of how much you have to spend to acquire an app user through paid means. But that also should help justify a budget to invest in own channels, because now you have something to compare it to. And then a final note here, not all installs are the same. So you'll want to break down this stat by acquisition source to show nuances in quality. You may see a different retention rate or average order value, for example, by source.
One of the things that always comes up here when we're looking at CPIs and having a target CPI, either for a specific team or by deciding what moves forward in terms of creatives or copy or sub-publishers or whatever it might be, is choosing your channel mix. And the question that always comes up here is, are we optimizing for a great CPI or effective scale? The classic debate, and I remember attending a Just conference when I first started working in mobile, was kind of the classic joke of a network promises a ridiculous CPI and they're delivering great users, but they can only deliver like 10 installs a day. Sometimes when you look at that mix, it can work really well, especially if you have a large team that's capable of, as you expand your network mix and run test budgets, keeping an eye on whether those channels are delivering quality at the CPI. When you move away from the really regulated networks, the 800-pound gorillas in our space, Facebook and Google, and to some extent Snap and increasingly TikTok, who have great audience targeting, but it comes with higher CPIs, is you do open yourself up to things like fraud, where networks who are working with unbounded sub-publishers or aren't able to do as much audience creation in their own platform. You do have to have your team really consider that as well. Most people work on that with their MMPs, which is useful. One thing I'll call out though is that we did an interview with Jennifer Sudo, who is at MNC Saatchi as a part of the iOS 14 rollout. She really encouraged companies that she's working with and called it out to us that as Scan changes some of the inputs that are available to ad networks and to us for evaluating their performance, is that we might start to see better CPIs and scale in a way where fraud is less of an issue, because some of the bounds that Apple has put on SCAD network for all its issues, it can help level out some of those things. So if you're thinking about 2021 and heading into 2022 and your budget, think about discussing this as a team or with your agency. Could you expand your overall network mix to get a better either blended CPI or CPIs in certain places, given the changes to the ecosystem that have happened over the past 12 months? So certainly something to keep in mind.
So moving on down the list of efficiency metrics, the next one we have is cost per action. Some companies also call this cost per conversion, but definitely cost per action is more prevalent. This is defined as the amount of resources invested in a campaign divided by the number of attributed actions, again, associated back to that campaign. This is pretty useful if you have bottom of the funnel activities that are of value to your app. So we've listed some of the examples here, but you may want to track the cost per action for, say, a registration, completing onboarding, or completing your profile. That's what we would recommend definitely reporting on this metric.
When it comes to CPA, there is an important distinction to be made if you're operating in the space, which is choosing your methodology in terms of who gets credit. The two most popular things here are last touch versus install touch, where last touch is the campaign that was the last touch before that user converted gets credit. Install touch is the campaign that drove the install that eventually led to the action within the attribution window gets credit. These both have trade-offs. If you're engaging in a lot of retargeting, some of those networks will require you to work with last touch, which can change up your holistic mix. Sometimes you might want to employ install touch only for a few networks. I definitely recommend working with your networks and your MMP to make these choices, with one caveat. Increasingly, due to SK Ad Network and a few other things, some of the biggest networks in our space, Facebook and Google, are actually moving away from a last touch model altogether, which is how the SANs typically in isolate, not deduplicated, would display in their dashboards and for their reporting impact. And they're moving towards modeled conversions, which we already had a lot of campaign optimization in that black box of you put in your creatives copy and targeting and bid structure, and they mix everything up and try and get you really good outcomes. The move towards modeled conversions in that space, given the deficit of device level data, is making choosing one of these methodologies harder and harder. Now, this doesn't impact Android today. We're not sure if Google will ever make a move in the same way Apple has towards more obfuscation of the GAID. But if you're thinking about methodology and you're thinking about using the data that you get for your Android users, which is still at that common device level that can be shared between destination apps and ad networks, and you're thinking about potentially doing lookalike audiences based on that data for iOS, just have that conversation with your team about what methodology is being used for what data set, because it's incredibly important in terms of, again, what's working, how it's working, and who is getting credit or what is getting credit for specific actions that are happening in the app, which will help you optimize.
And finally, rounding out our last efficiency metric, this one is return on ad spend, often referred to as ROAS, but this directly compares how much you're investing in a digital campaign against the revenue that's sourced from it. So sometimes this is represented as a ratio, like we've listed 5 to 1 here, which means $5 of revenue earned for each $1 spent. One tip here is to incorporate the total investment, so not just the media costs, but if you're also spending money on overhead with a partner or agency, or you're spending money on platform fees, to really loop those in as well and encompass it as part of your total ad spend.
In terms of optimizing your CPA, there's 2 separate things that we recommend teams take a look at, as well as using this as a metric benchmark or target. The first is what we might classically consider to be paid media optimization. A big part of that is making sure that you're targeting the right audiences, optimizing your bid structure. And we really recommend working with the ad network themselves and your account manager there to implement their best practices, so they can take the data from postbacks that your MMP is driving or other sources to do the optimization of the CPA that's the special sauce with their network. That's especially important if you're working with a network that uses, again, that black box optimization procedure to test creatives and copy. Shout out to UAC for popularizing that. It's actually been amazingly effective. Apparently, we should trust Google. Or as we're increasingly seeing model conversions. So give them the data they need to help you stretch your budget as far as you possibly can with quality installs that lead to great conversions and that great CPA. We really recommend implementing the full suite of optimization tools. Obviously, all networks integrate with MMPs, so that's making sure that your postbacks are structured in a way that the network can accept. The SRNs or SANs oftentimes will have like a very set data structure that goes through a machine learning process to make sure you're operating within that. Or if you're deviating from it, you're having a conversation with your account manager about what the consequences might be. But it's also for, if you're working with a network like Facebook, implementing the APIs, the pixels, the other things that will help them curate audiences for you that make the most sense and get you the most bang for your buck. The other side of this is optimizing the actual conversion funnel. And sometimes there's a handoff here between the acquisition team who brings users in, and then the product team or the lifecycle team that is bringing them through that funnel. And CPA is just kind of an output of that, which is why a lot of paid media teams don't want to necessarily optimize for that because they're not in full control of the experience. We really advocate for, as we move towards a world where we're looking at full customer experience and full monetization strategy as the goal of mobile, to paying more attention to this, even as a team that's tasked with overall acquisition instead of all of those lifecycle marketing touches. We find when teams work together on the holistic strategy, it can be the easiest way to get CPA down and make your ad budgets go farther, even though it seems a little bit counterintuitive or out of that team's purview. Part of that is channel diversification. So if we can touch a user on push, that's most typically the channel people opt into. If they're signing up for a profile as part of their onboarding process, trying to get them to opt into email communications, again, can give us that secondary touch, which will work for a lot of users. And then also if during the onboarding process or during that, day 1 through 7 period, You can create a ledge to get users to opt into SMS communications. It's a far less crowded channel that can be really powerful as well. And again, having that diversification that helps users get to the aha moments that lead to long-term retention and monetization is one of the best ways to bring down that CPA and make your budget go farthest. The other side of this is frankly install context. So a lot of times we bring users to the app, and again, the App Store traditionally strips away all of the context on where they came from. MMPs in the back end will give you the data around what really worked. We really encourage companies to think about using the context of the install itself to optimize the conversion funnel too. Going to the App Store is a pretty alienating experience when users show up in the app. They feel like you had a lot of context on who they were because the creative resonated with them. It was really targeted towards their audience. Then they drop into the app and all of that context is lost. We obviously operate in the deep linking space. This is very top of mind, but we encourage folks to use that information that comes into the client about a deep link from a paid campaign to give certain experiences to users who came from certain creatives or came from certain campaigns or copy that provides continuity with what got them interested enough to click and go through that install process with the first experience you give them. You can work with your product team to let them know what you're putting out there and how you're attracting users to the app, and they can incorporate that into a couple of A/B tests in terms of onboarding flow. You can see those CPAs go down because you're providing continuity and getting more users to opt into the next step, which will get them to that aha moment. So definitely as you work as a holistic team, balance these things together. What's traditionally in the space of the paid advertising team, this campaign optimization, as well as working with your cross-functional partners to make sure that the great installs you're bringing to this app are really getting the best possible experience that will bring down your CPAs and allow you to do more.
All right, who's ready for some advanced metrics? Let's dive in, Grady. All right, so the first one we'll go over is average order value, or AOV. To calculate this, you'll want to find the sum of order values and divide them by the number of orders in that same period. So this is particularly useful when you can break down the stat by acquisition source to see how that affects the size of the orders. Also, I would highly recommend you compare your AOV on your mobile app to your web app if you have one, your mobile web app. We frequently see AOVs higher on mobile due to reduced friction to browse and complete a transaction. And 100% anecdotally, I know if I have to go find my credit card, there's a high chance I will not complete that order. Okay, so moving on to order frequency. This is essentially defined as how often an app user is completing an order. For this, you'll want to divide the number of orders by the number of app users in the same period. And we usually see this limited to a monthly or yearly window. This stat is really pretty useful for measuring the lifetime value of app users, a stat that Grady will cover in the next slide. And yeah.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that in a second. The one thing we encourage people to take a look at is what we would expect for a lot of companies is that for their app, they see a higher frequency and a higher average order value. Sometimes that's actually not the case. There are instances where we'll see when a company is looking at the raw metrics without context, where the average order value in the mobile app is actually less than on the mobile web or desktop web. Like Dan said, there can be more friction to convert on mobile web where you're not able to just have a biometric that auto applies your credit card or Apple Pay natively built into the experience. So sometimes a user won't convert on mobile web until the order reaches a certain activation threshold, or it's large enough that it's worth it to do that work. A lot of times on mobile, we'll see the higher order frequency where customers are willing to make that order more often just because there's less friction in the process than on other platforms. And that can look a little bit differently for your business. And that's where we always say to apply context to these metrics. If you're seeing something that either is a little bit counter to what you've seen at another industry or feels a little bit weird because there's a thesis that these mobile app users are worth a lot more, dig into that and see how it reflects user behavior in your business and whether you can provide that context to teams who are consuming the data to help them make the right insights and analysis on it. When we look at LTV, that's exactly what we're getting to. LTV is where we're multiplying out the average order value by the order frequency by that customer lifetime period. And so a lot of things we've previously discussed influence this, right? If we have a higher average order value, if we have a higher order frequency, and if we're retaining users as active for longer, we can bump up that LTV. And we can look at the correlation between the type of users that we're bringing in top of funnel and what has the highest LTV. But this is really where we get into what's correlated versus what's caused. And when we look at sustainable mobile growth that drives monetization, it really does become a cross-functional effort between these things all working together in the best possible way and leaving as few drop-off points as possible so we can justify our investment by realizing the LTV that we would expect if things are going well. The monetary value that your app, your business expects to make from each incremental user is the definition. And that is why fundamentally companies are investing in this space, and it justifies all of our jobs. So making sure that we're optimizing for this as a core unifying metric, separate from what individual teams are gold on, is definitely the gold standard of what we expect companies to look at. Let's get into one that isn't talked about necessarily as much, especially in the paid media space, which is app stickiness. This has a couple of other names, but the concept really is how sticky is your app. It's where we're looking at the ratio between something like DAU and MAU or sessions per MAU. And it's really a measure of how often your active users are returning into the app, where the higher values represent more engagement over that measurement period. The reason we provide a couple formulas here is different companies will look at different things. The interesting thing about app stickiness is it is one of the metrics that requires a lot of context to use well. And it's one of the places that most actively calls out metrics versus meaning and using it really well as a company. Let's take a concept of sessions per DAU. So 5 sessions per DAU. I'm logging into this app 5 separate times and ask ourselves, is that a good thing or is it not? Well, there's actually a couple of legitimate answers to that. When we look at this is a great thing, this metric means our business is doing well, there's a lot of companies that can fall into that space. And those are people where you want lots of engagement with the app. It relates to the monetization thesis. An app like Zillow, who is generating leads for realtors, it's a time-dependent motion, especially in high-demand markets, Bay Area, New York, increasingly all over the country because of COVID, much more so than 18 months ago. If they don't get that listing in front of you right when it happens, they really have 12 to 48 hours in a lot of those markets to do so before they can't turn it into a revenue generator. And so you want those lots of sessions because you're getting the right kind of properties in front of people and you're doing it in a way where they can actually action it. Same thing with Tinder. They've engaged in a lot of gamification around the social and dating experience. So they really want people coming in, consistently swiping when they have those moments in the day, and then also acting really quickly on conversations where you don't have time to back out or overthink it, and you're creating those moments of interaction. It's really critical because they operate in an ad-supported way as well as subscriptions, and you want that consistent engagement. There might be an upper limit in terms of the Goldilocks number here. So maybe if it's 25 sessions per DAU, that might be too much where a user will burn out. So there still is a lot of calibration to do when you look at how this metric changes over time. But overall, there is a category where we want this number to be pretty high. The category in the middle might be something like Noom. Now, for those who aren't familiar with Noom, they're probably best known as a weight loss app where they use CBT-focused habit building to get their customers to lose weight in a subscription model. They also have a segment of their business that works on anxiety management using a lot of the same underlying principles. And for them, there's a balance to be had here that's maybe a little bit stricter than the previous case, where if you've got users logging in at certain times when you're prompting them to, maybe to log their meals or to do their daily activity, that's great. We want them to do that because it shows they're engaging and they're more likely to renew their subscription month over month. If, however, they're logging in constantly, especially on that segment that's maybe anxiety management, it might show that some of those things aren't working, or we're not showing them the right things, or they're over-reliant on it, and that might lead to them not seeing the value and then churning month over month. So again, this metric means something in different context to this kind of app. And so understanding what you're actually going for, what your aha moments are, and what your stickiness looks like should help calibrate how you're using it. And then there's the last category of apps, sorry about that, where it actually might be a red flag to see this number go up. Now, some of these pretty standard, right? If I am engaging in 5 sessions a day with the Xfinity app that's related to my internet service, maybe not the streaming one, it probably means something is wrong. I can't pay my bill. I can't find the support ticket I need. I'm having trouble with something. And so that number going up is probably not something we all want to celebrate. There's probably a standard amount that we want to see that max, maybe once a month, and like additional sessions don't necessarily say the user is having a great experience. The Macy's one might be a little bit more surprising. I'm not saying this is necessarily a bad metric for them. They might want to see a certain number of sessions. What I'm also pointing out is just the complexity of this metric. A user who is having significant sessions per MAU might actually be price benchmarking some of your items versus another app if you're not seeing the associated conversions. And this is, again, where having the context on that metric and the ability to have the conversation across teams is really critical. If you're seeing sessions per DAU go up for that kind of app, but you're not seeing a rise in overall purchases or order frequency for that user, or LTV if it's a calibration between value or order value and number of orders, it might be time to dig into that specific customer segment here and understand what's driving up those sessions without the corresponding monetization. So again, just examples to help show the complexity of this specific metric and how teams really need to be cognizant and having a cross-functional relationship in order to use it well. Last one here, win-back rate. So win-back rates, we talked about this in a little bit of a context earlier. This is where we're looking at the number of reactivated users or the number of active users that were previously part of an inactive cohort. So most MMPs will have the concept of a re-engagement cohort. This is where we're looking at users who were inactive for a 7 or 30-day window, tends to be most typical, who were influenced to re-engage with the app through a specific campaign. In the context of paid media teams, it's typically a re-engagement campaign, although if your audience targeting isn't perfect, sometimes it'll be an acquisition campaign or if someone's been dormant long enough. It can also be someone who reinstalls the app through a targeted campaign because we didn't have them as churned. It could even be something, and some teams, especially in the e-commerce space, will define it this way: a user who has previously abandoned a cart who completes checkout. And this is a really important metric for looking at how are we, again, moving, it ties into DAU and MAU, how are we moving that metric along, as well as these users already have a certain amount of brand understanding and brand affinity. So sometimes winning them back can be a cheaper overall value proposition when we're looking at what is the cost of a specific action that's related to monetization versus bringing net new users into the top of the funnel. So if you're just looking at that top of funnel CPI metric, think about adding in win-back rates or assigning a specific portion of your team or budget to this area, because it can have outsized impact in terms of getting the down funnel results you want.
Grady, so we talked about a lot of metrics. They all seem very important, but which ones should we report on and report up to leadership teams? So a recommendation here is choose a few key metrics that are the most impactful to your business and best represent your initiative. So Grady gave a lot of examples about different verticals and different business models that might be looking at different metrics for various reasons. So it really depends on your business, but we have collected some examples to get the gears turning for you a bit. So in this first example, say you are focused on acquisition and you would like to get more app users and you are running a specific campaign. Some of the metrics that you may select are attributed installs, cost per install, and 7-day retention. The trio of these metrics show that you are bringing in app users at a good price and they are returning and continuing to use your app. Or you may, if you do have revenue metrics also set up, you may go a step deeper than this and maybe go for attributed revenue, ROAS, and 7-day retention. So those would be the three that we'd recommend for this example. For the next one, say you are managing an e-commerce app and you're making UI changes to try to increase revenue. Well, in that case, then it might be most effective for you to report on average order value and order frequency and how that affects the LTV of your app as well. So those would be what we'd recommend in this scenario. And then third example, we saw this a lot after COVID as well. A lot of companies focusing on re-engagement and getting people to return to their app. So in those examples, you may want to prioritize win-back rate, attributed conversions, and cost per action to show that your campaigns and your initiatives are bringing people back into your app. With that being said, I think a tip here is, while you may only roll up a few major metrics, definitely have the backup metrics ready to go to support those. So a lot of times what we do is we'll have appendix slides or drill down links that will show that there are other metrics supporting those and that everything else is fairly stable and we're really focusing on improving this one that we're reporting on. So in summary of what we discussed today, you want to make sure that you have a strong foundation for your measurement practice at your business. That includes common definitions of metrics, figuring out what the source of truth is for each one, and making sure that you're accurate, right? So a lot of these metrics were actually built on other ones. So if your attributed opens, for example, is messed up, then it's going to affect downstream metrics as well. So I think we talked about this a few times, but you will want to decide which metrics are most important for your business. And you can use this deck as a tool. We'll share it out. We also will share it as part of a blog post, but definitely you can come back and reference the definitions of each of these metrics here. Choose a few and report those up. And don't get overwhelmed by trying to optimize and track everything at once. Instead, it's a lot more efficient to focus on and iterate. So focusing on the ones that have the most impact for your business and then iterating from there. So once you nail one, you can move into the next one over time. And I think that's all we had. I think we do have time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please send them through the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom. And either Grady or myself will address them.
Yeah, okay. Boy, that was a lot. We got through a lot of stuff. Turns out there's a lot of metrics that you could track. Who knew? So we got a question here around what are some trends to balance performance marketing, CPI or CPA driven, and brand marketing, CPM driven on mobile? Great question, especially as more networks are looking at monetizing on a click-based model or going for overall CPM bidding strategies. It gets even more complicated for how do you bid on something different than what you're actually measuring. I think a couple of things. So one is it's a little bit of brave new world, especially where we're looking at a bid strategy that's again separate from the impact strategy. So we there recommend looking at the campaigns, benchmarking campaigns where you have strong inputs from the pre-iOS 14 period and matching those up against what you're looking at from a CPM model. That's a little more tactical. When it comes to overall strategy and balancing these things, couple things here. One is get a sense of where your top of funnel is coming from. So if you're having to get all of your installs from paid media, it's potentially time to spend more on brand awareness or on a brand introduction step that has a lower activation energy, bringing someone to your website, bringing someone to explore something, and then later looking at the associated CPI. The second thing is, even if it's not an app focused campaign, we still recommend tracking it with your MMP, because if you're doing more brand awareness campaigns, but you can still track the impact of those campaigns over a specific period on are these people ending up in the app, it can really help give you some of that data. Dan, I'd love your perspective as well, since you look at this on a daily basis, how you think about mapping up those things and then tying it to our customers who are doing it on mobile.
Yeah, brand awareness is a tricky one because it is very difficult to measure. There are ways to kind of come up with metrics that can represent brand awareness, but it is sort of a you kind of have to believe in it and invest in it kind of thing. One thing I would recommend is attempting to test how brand awareness affects the downstream results of the business. And a way to do this is to run tests in certain geos, run brand awareness programs in one geo and see how that affects another one, or the basically the control for other geos. But it is a tricky one. I don't know if there's a right answer on how much to invest in each one. It sort of depends on your business.
I have another question here around, do you typically see companies using a CDP to help with all of this? Short answer is yes. Using a CDP can help make sure, like we talked about at the very beginning, that you've got a very defined data ontology and that's being really cleanly translated across your entire organization. And it can also simplify things for your engineering and data teams a lot, which can help you engage in more channels and spend the time that you work with them instead of doing a bunch of different tags for the same things with slightly different definitions, which can make all of your data more complicated, that you're doing that tagging once and then putting it in the systems it needs to be in. So typically with companies where there's an advanced mobile marketing stack and they're really invested in this as a platform and critical for their business, we'll see a number of tools, some form of CDP, some form of product analytics tool, some form of MMP, and some form of mobile marketing automation. Those tend to be the core pieces, in addition to all sorts of other things and logic that's layered on top that allows people to execute on all of this really well and move their metrics.
Sounds good. Grady, I see a question that has come in here. How should we set targets for our app metrics when our business has large swings due to seasonality? We definitely do see this taking place. If you are, for example, a gym, you might see a lot of users in January and then they'll drop off by February. Or if you are really focused on e-commerce, you may see a huge spike around the holidays. What we tend to recommend is if you have a full year of data, you can always compare to the same time range in the previous year. And you can forecast what you will expect this year compared to your growth rate applied to last year's results at the same time. So you may want to, instead of setting one target, for example, an MAU target that is stable throughout the year, you may want to break it down by month so that you can incorporate some of that seasonality trend into your data. And of course, if you don't know what the seasonality trend for your business looks like, you may just have to guess. I think in a lot of cases, it doesn't make sense to spend a ton of time trying to get it right. A lot of times the setting of the target is more valuable than actually getting it exactly right. And after the first year, you'll have some of your own empirical data to rely on.
The other thing I'll add there is just understanding your campaign strategy at different points of the year can be really important. So if you've got great brand, but you don't have the impetus for people to immediately engage or monetize, let's say you're NBA, it's not NBA season, people still might want that app. And so you're going for more brand awareness or overall installs at a certain point, and then trying to put those resources towards re-engagement or win back during the season itself, because you've already set the groundwork of people who have that app on their phone, but aren't necessarily opening it up every day. Just changing your focus in terms of the overall year can also help with that, especially once you have an understanding of what that looks like Dan mentioned, for like kind of a standard year. Got a question in the Q&A. What is the main difference between unpopulated app events and organic app events that register in branch? I'm going to answer this, and then if there's specific fields you're looking at, definitely feel free to just shoot me a note on LinkedIn or via email at grady@branch.io, and we can get a little more specific. So organic is a term that, kind of like we've talked about, does not have a consistent meaning. So organic can mean non-paid, or it can mean like truly no touch before download. The way that's represented in branch is we look at an unpopulated app event where it's not tied to any referring campaign out of any of the channels that we track as being that unpopulated. And it's where we're seeing no touch versus an organic, which is typically, when we talk about organic with our clients, we're talking about a non-paid channel. So we're talking about email, we're talking about referrals or sharing or web to app, where we're not putting an incremental marketing dollar against that person. So that's really where we split that out. Because there isn't the incremental marketing dollar against those organic users, we tend to think they're a great way to, number one, actually improve the incrementality of your paid touches, because you're siphoning off the bucket of users that you don't necessarily, because they're already in your funnel, have to spend that dollar against. You can really spend that dollar against people who would not have known about your brand, would not have known about your app, were it not for that paid marketing campaign. The second way is by, again, like we talked about earlier, using those channels really well to make sure that you're giving your users the optimal chance to convert by bringing them back to the app and reminding them that that's where they'll find value if it's already installed on their device. And by doing that really well, raising your retention numbers, getting people to those aha moments, we can get to that lower CPA. If that was not what you're getting at, we can discuss that offline.
All right, well, we are at time. I wanted to take this moment to thank everybody for registering and attending this webinar. Both Grady and I have listed our emails on this slide. If you have any questions or want to talk about anything that we discussed, we are always open to chat. Please shoot us a note. Additionally, we would like to ask for your feedback on this webinar. So we've listed the URL for feedback down at the bottom of the slide. If you can provide us any feedback, we're always looking to improve and make sure that we deliver content that's really relevant to you and your role. One question, will we share the video? Yes, this was being recorded, so we'll send out the recording link in a few days.
All right, thank you so much, everyone. Have a super productive week, and see you at the next one.
Thanks, everyone.